At the present time, it is of paramount importance that the women and girls of our country be given training so that they may do their share in the war emergency. How this training is given and who does it is of great interest to us all. To some of us, the National Youth Administration stands out as the agency which is doing the best job along these lines at present. Today, as increasing numbers of men are called to military service, young women must be ready to step into their places without loss of time.
Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born 1884 on October 11th to Mother Anna Hall and Father Elliott Roosevelt, younger brother of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's early life was difficult. Her father was an alcoholic, and her parents' marriage was troubled. After her mother and father died, 2 years apart, when she was 10, Roosevelt and her two younger brothers went to live with their maternal grandmother in Manhattan and Tivoli, New York. Raised by her wealthy grandmother, Roosevelt was taught by private tutors until she was 15 and was sent away to Allenswood Academy, a prestigious all-girls school in England. There, Roosevelt blossomed into a socially responsible and independent woman. At 18, she returned to New York and began volunteering as a teacher for poverty-stricken immigrant children in Manhattan at the Rivington Street Settlement House and joined the National Consumers League, who fought against dangerous working conditions in factories and other businesses. On March 17, 1905, at 20 years old, Eleanor Roosevelt married Franklin Roosevelt, a Harvard student and her fifth cousin once removed. After meeting as children, the two did not see each other again until Roosevelt came back from England. They were married in Manhattan's Upper East Side in Eleanor's relative's house, where President Theodore Roosevelt escorted Eleanor down the aisle. They went on to have 5 children: Anna, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. Her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, began his political career 5 years later in 1910, when he was elected to the New York State Senate. In 1913, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy and held that position until 1920, when he made an unsuccessful run for vice president. Throughout this time, Eleanor volunteered with the American Red Cross and Navy hospitals during World War I. In the 1920s, she began her work in Democratic Party politics and was an activist for organizations such as the Women's Trade Union League and the League of Women Voters. She also co-founded Valkill Industries, a non-profit furniture company in Hyde Park in New York City, where the Roosevelt family estate was also located, and taught American literature and history at an all-girls private school in Manhattan. Sadly, Franklin Roosevelt was diagnosed with polio in 1921, which left him paralyzed from the waist down. Eleanor encouraged him to return to politics, and in 1928 he was elected as governor of New York, and then in 1934 he was elected as president of the United States. Eleanor was reluctant to become First Lady and feared that it would hinder her independence and end her work in activist organizations. But after Franklin was sworn in, Eleanor challenged and inevitably changed the traditional role of First Lady. Eleanor refused to sit around and play hostess, so she became an active participant in her husband's administration. The Roosevelts came into office in the midst of the Great Depression and enacted the New Deal, which helped those in poverty, created jobs, and boosted the economy. Eleanor traveled as First Lady during this time to check on the new government institutions created by the New Deal. Eleanor was an early advocate for civil rights, women's rights, rights of American workers, and the rights of those living in poverty. She was known for encouraging Franklin to hire more women for federal positions and held multiple press conferences for female reporters only, who were often banned from these conferences. In World War II, Eleanor was an advocate for refugees seeking shelter in the United States. She was also an advocate for issues concerning the troops, keeping up the soldiers' morale, and supported programs that encouraged volunteering in the States and women's employment in the defense industry. While the Roosevelts had one of the more memorable relationships between President and First Lady, it was also one of the more complicated. Early on in their marriage, Eleanor discovered Franklin was having an affair with the social secretary, and Eleanor offered a divorce. But Franklin chose to stay, knowing that divorce had a social stigma and not wanting it to affect his political career. Historians suggest that this unfaithfulness prompted Eleanor to become more independent and to further devote herself to her activism in the political and social world. After her husband died in office in 1945, Eleanor returned to New York, living in the Valco cottage where the former furniture factory was turned into a home, and her apartment in New York City. While some speculated that she would run for public office, Eleanor chose to remain an active citizen and activist. Roosevelt served as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations from 1946 to 1953. There, she oversaw the drafting and passage of the Universal Human Declaration of Rights. This was one of Roosevelt's most significant achievements, and one that she saw as a model for how people and nations should treat each other. From 1961 until her death in 1962, Roosevelt headed the first Presidential Commission on the Status of Women by request of President John F. Kennedy. She also served on the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, the Advisory Council for the Peace Corps, and numerous other activist organizations. After her time in the White House, Eleanor remained active in the Democratic Party politics, campaigning for candidates around the country. She also hosted a radio program, a television news show, continued to write her newspaper column, and gave lectures. Over the entire course of her life, Roosevelt wrote 27 books and more than 8,000 columns. On November 7th, in 1962, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt died at 78 years old from aplastic anemia, tuberculosis, and heart failure. President Kennedy and former presidents Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower attended her funeral. She was buried next to her husband in Hyde Park on the grounds of the Roosevelt estate. As you can see, overall, Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong and independent woman. It would make her happy to know that feminist women still look up to her and are still inspired by her achievements.